Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're talking about insider risk and insider threat, kind of insider risk management today, and it's really a concept that I think is misunderstood by a number of different companies out there. I have a lot of experience from my FBI days actually doing that and building different programs. But our idea here is to have a conversation by really looking at what has worked in the past, certainly how Optiv looks at this, and really helping to frame the conversation about, enabling your company to identify and then certainly mitigate those insider risks in a proactive nature and not just reacting to it. So again, James Turgal, previous 22 years with the FBI, was actually involved with building the FBI's insider threat program and insider risk program. And it was the second iteration of that because we, early on was one of those situations that I think a number of companies face out there where you have different groups of an organization, different parts of an organization. You've got chief security officer in one part of the organization. You then have the IT folks in another. And certainly in the FBI, we were no different. We had an insider threat group that had their own tools and their own, methodology. We had the security division that was doing its own thing, and we had IT on the other side. And those separate entities really is what causes these types of programs to fail. And so one of the things that I think is really important for companies to understand is this has to be a holistic part of your strategy. Insider risk, insider threat is always, I think, mistaken for it's just an insider program. It's just an insider who's threatening the organization. Totally not true. I mean, I've worked a number of different cases in my FBI career where that insider was either an insider because they were intentionally wanting to cause damage to the organization, or they unintentionally caused damage to the organization, or they were actually, in one case where the individual became an actual, intelligence officer for a nation state because they were a disgruntled employee and they were groomed by the Chinese in order to, steal data from the organization. So you cannot look at this in isolation. Insider can mean both that person who's inside. It can also be someone who is absolutely placed into the organization by organized crime, by competitors, and certainly by nation states. And I've worked a number of those cases. And it should encompass a lot of different aspects of your organization, right? It's IT, it's human resources. It is the security philosophy that should go with that. So Wendy, what are your thoughts on, getting started on what companies should kind of think about when it comes to building their program?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So, a little bit about my background, but just to share with everyone here, I started my career at the National Security Agency as an intelligence analyst, working in counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and foreign policy. I've leveraged a lot of that experience throughout my consulting career as well, where I've helped clients think through how to design that holistic, proactive insider risk program that you mentioned. So at Optiv, the way that we try to help a lot of our clients is through that holistic lens. And that's really fundamentally, the wave of the future for insider risk or insider threat. There are a lot of companies that still think about it very much from a cyber-centric point of view. And of course, there's lots of different things from a cyber perspective that we can use to really help from a prevention, detection, mitigation, recovery type activity. But there's so much more to it than just cyber. And really getting our clients and others to understand that, from that holistic perspective, there's physical, there's general other behavioral activities that you may not be seeing in that logical environment that you need to, really bring into your program and your understanding of that holistic risk. That's really the critical piece in getting people to push their programs forward and become more mature. The second element that I'll share with that with you too about that is really just that from a proactive perspective, you can't be proactive without necessarily understanding the risks that you're looking for and how those behaviors can present those risks, right? So again, that holistic perspective, if you're just looking at someone's, login activity as an example, that doesn't necessarily tell you too much about maybe why they might be logging in at weird hours or downloading an inordinate amount of data or something like that. But if you see that, hey, they actually put in their 2 weeks notice the other day, that might give you a little bit more context and understanding this person actually is doing something that could be considered out of the ordinary from their business as usual type activities. So that's one of the ways that we really think about it. But at the end of the day, there's lots of tools and different other, security solutions that you can look at that are very, very helpful. But if you're not sitting back and thinking about this strategically, how you want to incorporate the different elements of security that you already have in place into your insider risk program, and on top of that, really understanding where you want to take it and what risks you're really seeking to mitigate, it's going to be hard to really leverage those tools effectively. You might end up with a very expensive tool that does a lot of really cool, fancy things, but doesn't really help you to mitigate the risk overall. And most importantly, doesn't help you to kind of get left on that spectrum of ideation to execution or action, and really getting more towards that ideation piece so that you're mitigating the risk proactively as quickly as possible. I know that you've had a lot of experience in doing that as well, Jim. I would really be interested in understanding some more about how you've leveraged tools effectively, but also looking at that more programmatic element.
No, thanks. And let me go back just for a second about some of the stuff that you talked about, because it's really important for everybody to understand the people part of this. We talk about anybody who's been in cyber, right? We talk about that cyber is really more of I think is more of a people problem, a people issue than a technology issue, right? Right. I've interviewed the Chinese and the Russians and the bad, organized crime threat actors out there, right? They're after data. They're after your data to monetize it, right? They're the threat actors out there. But if there wasn't that human element, both inside the organization and outside the organization, right? We wouldn't have jobs, but right, we wouldn't be having this conversation because everything would be protected. And so it's really important for any program out there. You have to have what I call buy-in from key stakeholders. You have to have the human relations folks there. And part of my experience with the FBI was when I was the chief human capital officer for the organization before I became the CIO. And one position led to the other. And a lot of that was me understanding when we were building our insider risk program and insider threat program about the people aspect of it, right? There's certainly a technology and a governance piece that you talked about, Wendy, which was knowing that this individual employee is leaving in 2 weeks, right? There's a process for that, but it really, a mature insider risk program should really be designed about what are those things that your employees are actually doing? How are they reacting? Are there social media aspects out there? I've worked a number of different cases where you have individual employees who are disgruntled and they're out on social media and they're bashing their employer. And guess what? The Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans, they actually skim the internet and skim social media networks for that type of data to see if they actually want to attack that company. And so this has to be not just a holistic IT program and a cyber program, but it has to be a people part as well, because you absolutely need the people aspect of this, both inside the organization to understand and to get buy-in, because there's a lot of there are privacy issues, there are certainly culture issues, which leads to a lot of different conversations between employees that feel that the company, the big brother, is watching everything that they're doing and not trusting them. And it's not about that. It's about the employees understanding this program is there to protect them. It's also there to protect the data, protect the company, protect their livelihoods. But there has to be a people part of it. And I think sometimes that really gets lost with certain organizations. You
Yeah,
know,
I agree, Jim. And actually, if you don't mind, there's one key thing that you just mentioned there, which is that it's also meant to protect the people that, we're potentially monitoring and the like, right? I know that that's really hard to get across to employees as well. And that's where that communication, training, and awareness piece really, and the cultural aspect especially, really comes into play. But at the end of the day, there is a bit of a kind of a honey vinegar type situation with this, right? And there are a lot of things that companies can do that tend to be a little bit more positively viewed that can help to mitigate risk on insiders, right? So I think that's a really important aspect. I just wanted to reiterate that there.
no, you're absolutely right. And culture plays such an important role here, right? Because every organization, right, the FBI has a particular culture. Companies have a particular culture inside them, and I have seen a number of different programs, insider risk programs, fail because they tried to put too many tools, monitoring tools, onto their networks. I certainly one of the examples and experiences I have as the CIO of the FBI. We were working an insider risk issue, and this is before we had actually put together kind of this as a platform where there were different aspects, right? The insider risk guys are off doing what they're doing, and they're looking at particular activities or behaviors of the employees, right? I've got the security division who are employing tools out on my networks when I'm the CIO, right? And I actually had a situation where we had so many monitoring tools sitting on one particular office and one particular employee's desktop, that the guy sitting next to him, right, it would take about 30 seconds, 45 seconds for the other guy to boot up his system. And the subject of this inquiry, it took 15 minutes for his system to boot up, and they're sitting next to each other. Right now, that's a failure on both a strategy level. It's a failure of the tools because they employed so many tools. And let's face it, right? The guy is looking at the guy next to him, going, "Wow, why is your system so much faster?" It's lessons like that. It has to be right. It has to be coordinated. There needs to be a platform, and I actually designed kind of a platform as a service where we had like a task force environment where you literally have all of the data from the IT network guys that are understanding what's normal on your networks. You've got the HR folks who are not giving away any privacy secrets and not giving away privacy information about employees, but they're able to understand if that employee, if an employee's name comes up, they're able to go back, work the issue from an HR standpoint, provide some context to the larger program as to how why is this individual even being looked at. Is there any backstory, right, Wendy, to your point? Is that person, did they give 2 weeks notice? Do they have a history of are they the employee, right, who finds a thumb drive out in the parking lot and tries to plug it into the desktop, right? We've seen those as well.
Yeah.
And so it's really having that context about the employee, which is so important to be able to give the tools, right, to give the the actual platforms themselves something to work on and actually makes sense. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's really critical, right? Because if you don't set up the tools correctly, I mean, a lot of people worry more about integrations with data and all those different types of connections, which of course is very critical to the success of the tool. But there's lots of other kind of back end processes and thought that needs to go into it to make those tools successful too, just in how you integrate it across the business. And it's not just looking at IT, HR, legal, ethics, but also the business as well, because that culture aspect can be critical too. What's business as usual for one portion of the business may not be in another. It may also be business as usual for, individuals with privileged access versus not with others, right? And then, another thing that we're seeing quite a bit that companies are struggling with at this point is not only privacy concerns, like you mentioned, around global privacy laws that are recently coming into effect, or those that have been established for a little while, but also thinking through, working from home and lots of kind of hybrid work models or total work from home models that a lot of companies are having to deal with now. And what does business as usual look like in that point? How do you actually protect your data while still enabling your workforce to do the jobs that they need to do now that they have to connect to a printer at their house instead of one at the office? Simple things like that are very difficult for you to really put the proper controls in place that you may have been able to restrict more easily before, without really hurting that user experience to make it, kind of more IT focused. So have you had any interaction with clients thinking through what that might look like from this kind of COVID and post-COVID type workforce scenario, Jim?
Yeah, no, I have, and certainly, my previous life prior to Optiv, I had a number of different engagements, and certainly a few at Optiv since joining, and one thing that really comes around, and it's always been an issue with, from a cyber risk standpoint, right, is the whole training and awareness, right? We talk a lot about training a workforce, and yes, we do phishing, email training, and there's what we call the habitual clickers, right, who are out there always clicking the link that they shouldn't. So imagine now you have a situation where all these employees who used to be in your brick and mortar building, right, where you could somewhat control the environment, right? You could control the networks, right? You could control the ability, of when they got the phishing training, and you could, and some certainly mature companies would come in and utilize HR tools or bonuses or disciplinary action in order to try to stop the habitual clickers. Well, guess what? Now those individuals are sitting at their house. They are utilizing their home networks and home router. And I would virtually bet money that the password on that home router, right, is the word password, and it's not capitalized, right? And so it is, you have not only cyber risk issues there, you have this huge training gap, but also, one of the things you and I have certainly worked on together before, but I want your thoughts on, is the physical security side of this as well. Because all too often, right, again, companies get focused on, well, this is just an insider, some bad employee inside our organization, and it's so much broader than that.
It is, and with work from home, especially, that potential physical element broadens even further, right? Unfortunately, we've seen at the workplace still some situations where physical violence has taken place, whether by a current or former employee, just in recent months in the last year. And then, of course, too, there's potential, now domestic violence type situations that we have to worry about for people working from home, right? And how that extends, how companies support and or potentially intervene if necessary, is another thing that really gets into that cultural element and understanding the holistic perspective of insider risk. Because as stated before, it's not just meant to protect the company's assets from a, resources or IT type element, but really also to help the resources as so far as the people element as well. We've talked a lot too about leveraging social media with clients to help understand what does that, outside of work perspective look like, which nowadays can be a little tricky, especially because of privacy elements, but then also just making sure culturally that you're not setting yourself up to potentially instill further insider threats because people feel that they're constantly being watched, not trusted, all those types of things, right? So there's lots of different balances there about not only the physical elements so far as working from home and then what we are seeing at workplaces that are still in person, but then also thinking through some additional home elements too, right? But more with that physical element, one of the key things that a lot of people aren't thinking about as well is, as much as we hope that this would never happen to any of us, but what are you leaving out and your family members or visitors to your house, even if it's someone coming to work on your air conditioning because it's summertime and it always breaks in summertime. What are they potentially seeing or having access to as well, and making sure that, just like in the office, that you're not necessarily leaving things out for people to see that they shouldn't. You're not giving people undue access to different areas of your house when they're coming to work on that air conditioning or something else, right? Thinking about your home office as the office like you do at the workplace is really important too. And to your point, making sure that your employees think about that as well through training, updates in training, and or just intermittent emails or other communications that help them to think from that perspective, can also be really, really helpful as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I want to kind of turn this a little bit more to the the practical, and how should they be thinking about this, right? And so we talk a lot about roadmaps. We talk a lot about that whole concept of operations, and it's a great way to build a strategy. But the insider threat piece needs to be thought of a little differently, because again, it can be an outsider who is trying to access an insider. Could be an insider, again, both intentional or unintentional, right? It's trying to figure out from your company's perspective, what are those risk indicators, right? What are the things, because I can certainly tell you from experience that the risk indicators that we looked at inside the FBI for our employees are going to be different than the risk indicators that at some private sector company, right? So Wendy, what are your thoughts on the whole risk indicator piece?
I think it's critical to really understand that, and through that also defining the company's risk tolerance as well, right? Another critical element there too is, as you think about that governance aspect, is ensuring that you're coordinating with other elements of the company, of the business, to understand what those PRIs, potential risk indicators, should look like, because you can kind of derive those from a cyber or IT perspective in a bit of a siloed manner. But again, is that really going to help you to understand the contextual risks and the other risks that could help you to really understand, actually, this individual should be increasingly elevated because of what else is going on? And with that, another key thing that some of the tools that we've seen do pretty well, others might be lacking in, or yet still aren't able to do from a holistic perspective, is correlating and aggregating that risk and helping you to give that holistic perspective again. But really here, what I mean is, as an example, you can assign a certain level of risk, say a weighted risk, to inserting a USB into your laptop. You can assign, the same or a different level of risk to visiting some sort of, sharing website that's maybe not approved by the company, right? But the two together could show you that this person might be trying to exfiltrate data, more so than you would typically anticipate would be typical, right? And if you don't correlate those activities and understand the elevated risk and how they potentially aggregate and add on to each other, that's basically, you're just looking at the same kind of stuff that you would be looking at a SIM or some other logging monitoring type application, right? So helping to build out, in a way, kind of a risk management framework that does that for you and helps your analysts to understand that information more holistically is also critical as well, and something that we've seen a lot of people trying to do to mature their programs. And again, to your point earlier, taking that cultural perspective, the business perspective, and understanding that it's a person-centric type issue and potential solution as well. I know you've talked with a lot of clients about that issue as well. Do you have anything else that you've seen that clients have been thinking about from a potential risk indicator perspective?
Yeah, and it's usually you have, of the clients that I've spoken to, the ones that struggle with this, insider risk sometimes is one of those things that's just too hard, right? It's too big. They don't know where to start. And they certainly, from a risk indicator, they don't necessarily have a mature enough human resource type of program, and there's no correlation between what HR is doing and what IT and cyber are doing at the same time. And there has to be, usually those are completely siloed organizations. Um, and that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? Is being able to understand, certainly the cyber folks can come up with, types of activities and types of behavior on the systems, on the networks, that if they then educate the HR folks about, hey, here's what you should be looking at for, from an HR standpoint of those individuals that you could flag for us that might, show those types of indicators, and be able to pass information back and forth. And one of the ways I found this to get past the fact that this is just too big to tackle, right? Too hard of an issue. And one of the things we did at the FBI was to create this pilot program to start building what are those indicators, right? What should we be looking at? What type of behavior? Taking a look at, bringing the HR folks to the table and saying, okay, we're going to do this. And yes, our tools, and I've seen many tools don't make a program, right? Tools are an added, bonus. They provide you with data. But again, this is really, like we've talked about, this is a people-centric problem. And I've worked just as many cases where you've got foreign nations, nation states, who are taking the information from previous attacks like the OPM hack and a number of others, and actually utilizing that data that's out in the wild to then target different individuals inside a company, inside the government. And so again, inside, outside, right? It's still that threat, but being able to come up with what is that pilot program so that it's not too hard. And one of the key issues that I want to talk about now is how do you communicate that to an organization? Because this will either succeed or fail, right? Based upon your company's ability, leadership's ability to communicate the necessary, the needs of the program. Why do we need such a thing? What are we trying to accomplish by doing it? What are your thoughts on the communications piece?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, just understanding where actually your program is going to sit and who's going to be in charge of it. But through that, getting cross-business buy-in as to that being the construct and how, really the cross-business is going to have governance, and really what that governance model looks like is critical too. So to be frank, in a lot of the really successful programs that we've seen, doing a lot of that back-end strategy, vision, and kind of governance model definition is what really set them up for success and enabled them to then clearly articulate not only across the rest of the business, maybe at potentially lower levels, but then especially to the workforce, what it is, why it's necessary, and again, how it's meant to protect not only the company, but most importantly, its employees as well. With that too, understanding how you, wherever the program sits, how you actually integrate all of those other elements, and understanding what gaps you have as well, because you may have a spectacular physical security program and your cybersecurity program is really getting up and running and more mature. Understanding from an insider perspective what gaps and risks might be present through some sort of assessment or otherwise can really be helpful as well, so that you then understand not only what you have to work with or don't have to work with, but then also you can really use that to influence the other areas that throughout the business, cyber, physical, HR, et cetera, to help achieve those gaps or mitigate those gaps and really achieve success. And it's not to say that, the business or cyber or whomever might want to close those gaps, right? But then at that point, you understand where you might have elevated risk or, a bigger kind of blinders compared to other areas, and can work with that and really move your program around that. But if you don't have that holistic understanding up front, and more importantly, that buy-in from the rest of the company, once you go out to really share that vision and understand what you have to work with to then move forward, it can be really tough to be successful. especially too, if you're having to start out from a more siloed perspective and then grow, a lot of times that can be difficult as well, because you may also have that siloed perspective. It's not to say that you can't expand, you can't be successful as you seek to really expand and mature your insider risk program, but it can be a little bit difficult. So making sure that you're starting out on that right foot and incorporating that kind of cross business working group for insider risk, and incorporating the right people from the start who are not only understanding of what you're trying to achieve, but able to make those key decisions for their area of the business as you're working through this is critical as well. So to be honest, there's a lot of strategy and governance type activities that people tend to kind of skip over because they do focus, as we talked about before, on those more technical solutions. And like you said, tools are tools, right? They can be used to support your program, but they're not going to be the thing that's truly going to help you mitigate the risk at the end of the day.
Right. And it's just, just to kind of foot stomp something you talked about earlier, this is about and we throw around words like, employee. Well, guess what? Employees are full-time employees, they're part-time employees, they're contractors, right? And you mentioned earlier, what is the company's risk tolerance? Well, you should be having these types of conversations about risk tolerance with different types of employees, right? What do we allow our as far as privileged access management or just data access management with employees, right, versus contractors versus part-time employees? And now you really need to define that in a very broad way now, because guess what, those people are sitting at home again with their personal routers, and you're not having the ability to control the environment even somewhat, right, in a brick and mortar type of setting. And so your ability to be very broad in that discussion and that definition of what an employee is, I think is something that is really helpful for companies, because you need to have different rules for different types of employees, right? When you and I were government employees, right, we had security clearances, and based upon your security clearance, right, there's a different level of access. And I think companies should try to understand that it's not just open to everybody, and doesn't necessarily mean that every employee needs access to everything. And so access management is a critical aspect of this, and certainly being able to understand those different rules with different types of employees and the access management piece is really part of that philosophy, part of that bigger picture that you're talking about earlier, as far as that holistic strategy, because you need to account for all of those different types of organizational positions, and who should have access to what, and why. And then I kind of to bring this full circle, right? We talked a lot about the people part, right, and the strategy and the holistic part, right? But there's also, as you mentioned earlier, the cyber risk piece, right? Is it risk-based monitoring? Is it critical assets, right? Is it, what is the brand protection? Give me your thoughts on how do we take everything that you and I have talked about thus far, right? The people, the potential tools, right? The strategy. How do you tie in the cyber piece?
Sure. So I think one of the critical elements there is, and it kind of in coordination with understanding that risk tolerance piece, is understanding what are the critical assets, right? You mentioned asset management. If you don't know what you're really trying to protect and what's most important to the business, then how do you really know what your risk tolerance is? Typically, a lot of times that ends up being something that sits in the IT realm, whether it be some sort of database or system or software, or maybe data itself, right? So understanding that will be critical to then not only understanding the risk tolerance and being able to level set that, and then all of the other things we talked about for PRIs, but also where you need to potentially implement additional controls or additional monitoring or whatever the case may be to help you to mitigate that risk and get it to the level that you feel is tolerable. With that too, there's lots of different things that as you're thinking about that risk management framework or how you roll out a proof of concept type activity, that you can look at different more cyber-centric type contextual indicators or other activities to really understand what it is that you want to do from a cyber perspective. So here, what I mean is maybe for that initial rollout and proof of concept, you focus on privileged access users, right? So those individuals you may think are riskier because of their privileged access. And then through that also, you're able to then use those cyber tools and cybersecurity know-how to really understand, okay, is this a risk that we can mitigate, whether it be through additional monitoring or additional controls, or maybe even, something as simple as new policies or new kind of communication around those policies too. Because if people don't know what's expected of them, then how can you expect them to achieve it, right? So there's lots of different elements there that you can look at. Of course, we've talked about that tools aren't going to solve the problem, but they can definitely enable it. So looking at from a cyber perspective, the tools that you have to be able to achieve the risk tolerance or risk level that you want to, there's of course different things from a controls perspective, a monitoring and logging perspective, and then lots of other tools that you can use as well to help you get there. What do you already have in place? Have you considered what you have in place to be able to leverage that first before going out and buying something else, right? Because sometimes what you have and maybe even capabilities within that tool that you're not currently using could help you to mitigate that risk to an achievable level without incurring additional costs. Now, it's not to say that, everyone's going to be able to solve the problem with what they already have in place, but those are some really critical first steps from a cyber perspective that we always try to help people think about, because it can be pretty daunting and it can be hard sometimes too to get the funding you need when you can't prove that you're necessarily, mitigating risks, because it's hard to prove a negative sometimes, right? But once it does happen, of course, as we all know within security, the money starts to roll in, but at that point it's too little too late. So understanding all those different perspectives and the value that it can bring to the company through achieving that risk tolerance or risk mitigation is critical as well.
No, absolutely. So as we wrap up here, Wendy, what two good takeaways for everybody today from your perspective about how to think about this?
Sure. So I would say that the first key takeaway is around understanding the culture, right? So it's not just cyber culture or culture of the business writ large, the holistic culture of the company, and integrating all of those different things to understanding what really makes sense from a tools and a people and a process aspect, so that as you're implementing your program, whether it be from the starting stages all the way up to really optimizing your mature program, that you're building something that not only mitigates risk, but also ensures that you're not, kind of inciting new insider threats in the process. Because as much as it may be easier for us to really just implement tons of different things that make it restrictive and make it easy for you to be able to log and monitor, that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes the people feel good about working at your company anymore. The other aspect that I would say there too is really about thinking hard about the tools that you have and the different capabilities from a security perspective overall. And I say that specifically not just for cyber, but for physical security as well. Again, insider threat or insider risk is really like a concept, right? It's not necessarily the same type of domains that we might typically look at from a security perspective. And I say that because it really combines a lot of the different domains that we typically look at to help understand that holistic risk and threat. So looking at your program, starting there and understanding culturally what you want to do, and then security wise, what you can do, and combining the two can really help your program get off on the right foot from the start.
No, that's really important. And, from my perspective, this is, you and I have used this term in the past, right? Holistic. And really, I just want to finalize what we really mean by that, right? This is every aspect of the company, right? It's IT, it's HR, it's legal, right? It's your general counsel's office needs to be involved in this. It's your ethics and compliance folks, right? It is the culture. It's what makes this company, it's what makes people want to work for your company. You need to highlight that, you need to celebrate that, and you need to communicate to your employees the fact that this program is there to protect them. It's to protect that culture. It is to protect, their livelihood, and to be able to utilize the tools, not to spy, right, but to make sure that you're secure in both data protection and or data loss, and certainly protecting those employees are there. That communications piece by far is the most critical aspect of any kind of insider risk program, and being able to bring all of that to bear, right? The coordination of all those separate entities, but being able to communicate that to the employees. And really, I mean, this has to be from the lowest level to the highest levels of the organization. Everybody has to have buy-in, right? From the mailroom to the boardroom, boardroom to the mailroom. This is really about, it's about building trust, not destroying trust.
100%.
So, yeah. So Wendy, thanks again for talking with me today about insider risk programs. And, I know we'll have many more opportunities to meet with clients after this to talk further.
Yeah, thanks so much for the time, Jim.